Hi everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in again for the third episode at this point in this Climate of Freedom series, where my good friend and the world's best known climate skeptic, Lord Christopher Monckton, and I will debunk some climate alarmist arguments and explain the climate science to you in a concise and interesting manner. Because there are so many arguments coming from the side of climate alarmism that really need to be fact-checked. But unfortunately, the fact-checkers on the left usually only tackle people like us, who just want to question the mainstream narrative. Today's question will be, is the IPCC honest? And this is a major question in this climate change series that we ought to ask ourselves again and again, because the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is responsible for putting out all those climate alarmist claims about humans being parasites to the planet because they cause global warming or a catastrophic amount of global warming with CO2 emissions only. So, I asked my good friend Lord Christopher Monckton to provide an example where the IPCC was wrong in their predictions and they did not have the integrity to correct their mistake and openly admit that they were wrong.
Well, Naomi, it's not a difficult challenge to prove not only that IPCC does fake science, but also that some of that fake science is, regrettably, deliberate. The science journal Nature devoted an entire editorial to the graph you see on the screen now. And I've called this IPCC's deliberate misrepresentation. Nature agreed with the IPCC that this graph showed not only that the rate of global warming is accelerating, but also that the acceleration is caused by our sins of emission. But that conclusion, which was based on the four ever-steepening trend lines laid over the top of the grey actual data, is a false conclusion.
I took a look at the graph that you sent me, but to me it does look as though it does show that there was a substantial amount of gradual global warming between 1850 and 2005. So please let me know, what is wrong with this graph?
The trend lines start 150 years, 100 years, 50 years and 25 years before 2005, where all the trend lines ended. They're all correctly calculated and positioned. They're calculated from the data using what's called the least squares method. But IPCC and, of course, Nature, which has become an anti-scientific and uncritical champion of climate extremism, so much so that it now refuses to publish skeptical papers, however sound they may be scientifically, have drawn not one, but two bogus conclusions from this graph. Now first, as you can see from the three yellow arrows that I have laid over the IPCC's graph, all of which are parallel to one another, the warming rate of the 25 years, 1980 till 2005, was just the same as the warming rate in two earlier periods. So that means there was no acceleration at all, just a very gently rising overall trend. It goes up and down and then up again. Secondly, even if the graph had shown an acceleration, and it doesn't, that would not necessarily imply that we caused the acceleration.
What the mainstream media and climate activists all over the world will have you believe, though, is that the IPCC is a reputable source of information on climate science. So once again, I do want to trust you, Christopher, so excuse my skepticism, but I do need to see some kind of proof that the technique that the IPCC has used, using multiple trend lines starting at different dates, is in fact a statistical fraud. Because you know exactly, Christopher, that otherwise people will continue to call us climate conspiracy theorists and put links to the Wikipedia article about climate change under my videos, which is quite annoying and humiliating because I'm just trying to point out some errors in the alleged real climate science, which to me looks more like a mainstream narrative that has very little to do with science.
Well, Naomi, I'll tell you a story. I was so angry when I saw this bogus IPCC graph that I arranged for a question to be put to ministers in the House of Lords to clarify whether the 3 yellow arrows that I've shown were indeed parallel, indicating that the IPCC story that warming was accelerating was false. Ministers confirmed I was right, but went on to say that mere facts like that were not going to change their policy of crippling the economy with totally unnecessary global warming policies. And later, as this graph shows, the University of East Anglia altered the underlying global temperature data set with the effect of showing that each successive warming period was steeper than before, when its previous data set had shown all 3 arrows to be parallel. As you can see on this graph, which is of their newer, altered data set, the arrows are no longer parallel. The yellow one at the right-hand side, closest to the present, is steeper than the others. It wasn't that way before.
So what you're saying is that facts did not persuade the policymakers to adjust their decisions. Did I miss something? Is that still in line with the scientific method? Christopher, honestly, that's just outrageous, that the ministers would not even think about changing their economically destructive global warming policy decisions. And what is even more outrageous, of course, is that the temperature data were manipulated after the event so as to show an accelerated warming rate that the original data did not show. So, did they have a good reason to do such a thing?
Well, no, Naomi, I don't think they did have a good reason for altering the data. What I can say for certain, though, is that as we shall see as this series unfolds, much of the case for alarm about global warming comes from exactly this kind of alteration of inconvenient data after the event.
Can you also prove that the statistical technique used by the IPCC was fraudulent?
Yes, Naomi, I can prove that the statistical technique used by the IPCC is indeed a fraudulent, bogus, misconceived technique. You see, if you look at the graph you can now see, it's the graph of a sine wave.
Yes, I recognize that. I do have some understanding of trigonometry, and from the very nature of a sine wave, as well as its appearance, it is obviously a repeating oscillation with zero trend that remains at zero forever.
Yes, that's quite right. By definition, a sine wave has a zero trend. But suppose we just look at the segment of the sine wave that is shown on the graph and calculate the trend of the curve using the standard least squares linear regression method used by the IPCC and others with the temperature data, you can see the red arrow there shows a very slight rising trend.
And that is because we have chosen our segment of the curve carefully?
Exactly. And that's just the same dodge as the IPCC used on its bogus temperature graph. In fact, we can do just as the IPCC did and add more trend lines, each one starting nearer and nearer to the right-hand side of the graph. See, there's a purple trend line, and now we can add an orange one. And these trend lines, each of them correctly calculated from the data by the least squares method, will each be steeper than the one before. Here's the yellow one at the right-hand side, falsely indicating that a graph that we know has a zero trend, neither rising nor falling over the long term, appears to have not just a rising trend, but an accelerating uptrend that is not there in reality.
But they can't have done that?
Those were the exact words spoken by Congressman John Linder in the United States House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., when I showed this graph there. It was at that moment that the Republican Party decided that they were no longer going to support the Democrats in their costly policies to end the freedom and prosperity of free market America in the name of saving the planet. I can prove the IPCC knew that the technique and thus the conclusion was bogus. as a result of an earlier mistake made by the IPCC when it had overruled its own expert reviewers and had falsely stated that all the ice in the Himalayas would be gone by 2035, and we'll be looking at that mistake too in a future video. Governments asked the Inter-Academy Council, that's a group that covers the major academies of science around the world, to put in an error reporting protocol so that people like you and me, who do not just believe what we're told about the science, we check it and we sometimes find it's wrong, could report errors, and the IPCC would have to take account of them and consider them properly.
That sounds like a very good idea to me. I mean, some healthy self-reflection would do the IPCC some good, it seems to me. So what did the IPCC do when you reported their mistake?
Well, when I submitted my report of this error, the IPCC flatly refused to correct it. They were unable to justify what they'd done, but they refused to make any correction. It was too embarrassing. So I contacted Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter. Now, he's the Professor of the Public Understanding of Risk at Cambridge, my alma mater. Now, he refused to comment. He said, in effect, that it was more than his job was worth to question the IPCC and tell the truth about this statistical dodge. So I went to another statistician who took one look at it and confirmed that the IPCC's technique was indeed completely bogus.
Well, in that case, I must draw the conclusion that the IPCC has failed to prove an acceleration in global warming, that it manipulated their own data, that it knew about its own mistake but did not have the integrity to correct it openly, and that even senior academics are now too scared to tell the truth. It is shocking and it is very disappointing to see how the sciences can be messed with when they are linked to such a political outrage. When way too many political reputations are on the line, it becomes a problem for the truth. It affects our freedom of speech. It affects our perception of reality. And most importantly, most tragically, it has impacted our belief in humanity, our confidence that we have achieved amazing progress over the last decades due to the industrialization. We are not parasites to this planet. We are not the virus. We are, in fact, a great contribution to a better and a healthier planet. This world is thriving because of us. This world is the best place to live that it ever has been. And the key ingredient that made all of this possible is freedom. Freedom of expression, economic freedom, freedom of science. And therefore, the most important thing that I want you to remember is I don't want you to panic, because panic makes you susceptible to control and manipulation. Instead, I want you to think. If you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like and a comment down below, because the more you engage with this video, the more visible it will be in the algorithm, which is very helpful because this channel is heavily shadow banned. And if you want to stay up to date with what I'm doing, I will leave my social media links in the description down below. And what you might be interested in is that I have to go to court against the German state media authorities because they want to force me to take down 3 of my most impactful videos. I will also leave a link to an article about this topic, as well as other content that refers to the court case in the description down below. Thank you so much for watching and have a nice day.